The morning of November 30th, 1942. In the black waters off Tassafaronga, near Guadalcanal, a Japanese destroyer moved through the darkness at flank speed. Below decks, a young torpedo man named Takeshi Yamamoto stood ready at his firing station, his hand resting on the launch mechanism for a Type 93 torpedo. He had loaded this particular weapon himself 3 days earlier, carefully following the procedures drilled into him during months of training. The flask-marked secondary air tank sat pressurized to 240 kilograms per square centimeter. Yamamoto did not know, because the Imperial Japanese Navy had classified it at the highest level, that this flask contained not air at all, but pure oxygen. He did not know that American destroyers steaming toward him assumed Japanese torpedoes could reach perhaps 10,000 yards at best. And he certainly did not know that in approximately 7 minutes, the torpedo he was about to launch would travel more than 4 miles through the water before tearing open the hull of the heavy cruiser USS Northampton, sending her to the bottom with over 50 men still trapped inside. This weapon, which Allied sailors would later nickname the Long Lance, represented one of the most audacious engineering gambles of the Second World War. Its development had begun 14 years earlier in the machine shops of the Kure Naval Arsenal, where a small team of Japanese engineers had pursued an idea so dangerous that their own navy had ordered them to stop. They continued anyway. The story of how they succeeded, and what their success would cost, begins not with triumph, but with an explosion. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. In the winter of 1928, Commander Toshihide Asakuma stood in a concrete bunker at the Kure torpedo testing facility, watching through a reinforced observation window as technicians prepared to fire an experimental torpedo into the calm waters of Hiroshima Bay. The weapon looked outwardly identical to Japan's standard 24-inch 8th-year type torpedo, 9 meters long, 610 millimeters in diameter, painted the regulation grey-green. But inside, everything was different. Where a conventional torpedo carried compressed air at 90 atmospheres to drive its engine, this experimental weapon carried pure oxygen at 250 atmospheres. The theory was elegant. Air contains only 21% oxygen, with the remaining 79% being nitrogen that contributes nothing to combustion. In a torpedo engine, this nitrogen heated up, expanded, and had to be expelled, creating the telltale wake of bubbles that betrayed a torpedo's approach. Pure oxygen would eliminate the inert nitrogen entirely, allowing a torpedo to burn 5 times as much fuel in the same space. The result, in theory, would be a weapon with unprecedented range and speed, running nearly weightless through the water. In theory, the reality, as Asakuma was about to witness, proved considerably more violent. The firing command echoed across the water. The torpedo launched smoothly, accelerating away from the test platform. For 3 seconds, everything appeared perfect. Then the weapon simply disintegrated. Not gracefully. The detonation was sharp and bright, sending fragments of metal spinning across the bay. The shock wave rattled the bunker's windows. When the spray subsided, all that remained was a slowly expanding ring of disturbed water and an oil slick the size of a tennis court. It was the 4th such explosion in 6 weeks. Each time, the sequence was identical. Successful launch, brief normal operation, catastrophic failure. The post-mortem analysis would be identical as well. Oil residue inside the oxygen system had ignited under pressure, triggering a chain reaction that turned the torpedo's oxidizer supply into a bomb. It happened so quickly that the safety mechanisms designed to prevent exactly such a failure never had time to engage. 3 days later, Rear Admiral Kaneji Kishimoto convened a meeting at the Navy Technical Department in Tokyo. Asakuma attended, along with the senior engineers from Kure. The atmosphere was tense. Kishimoto listened to the technical explanations with evident frustration. When the briefing concluded, he made his decision with characteristic bluntness. The oxygen torpedo project is suspended indefinitely, Kishimoto said. We cannot deploy a weapon that is as dangerous to our own ships as it is to the enemy. Return to conventional propulsion research. The order was absolute. The Imperial Japanese Navy would not risk its destroyers and cruisers carrying weapons that might spontaneously explode under combat conditions. The Americans and British had reached identical conclusions after their own experiments with oxygen propulsion in the early 1920s. Pure oxygen was simply too dangerous for operational use aboard warships. The laws of physics and chemistry seemed to permit no exceptions, but Asakuma did not accept this conclusion. Neither did his colleague, Captain Shizuo Yanagimoto, the chief designer at Kure. In their view, the problem was not that oxygen torpedoes were impossible, it was that they had not yet discovered how to make them work safely. There was a difference. For the next 2 years, Asakuma and Yanagimoto worked on the oxygen torpedo problem in near secret. Officially, their work had been terminated. Unofficially, they continued experimenting using research funds allocated to other projects, operating in a grey area between direct disobedience and creative interpretation of orders. They were not alone in this. The Imperial Japanese Navy in the late 1920s fostered a culture where talented officers were expected to show initiative, even perhaps especially when that initiative involved circumventing official channels. But there were limits. If their unauthorized experiments resulted in another catastrophic failure, or worse, if a prototype exploded aboard a ship, the consequences for their careers would be severe. The key to understanding the oxygen explosion problem lay in recognizing that it was not primarily a chemistry problem, but a timing problem. Oxygen and oil did not explode simply by being near each other. They exploded when brought into contact under specific conditions: high pressure, high temperature, and a source of ignition. In a torpedo engine, all three conditions existed simultaneously at the moment of startup. The starting valve opened, releasing a blast of high-pressure oxygen into the engine's combustion chamber. This oxygen flowed through pipes and valves that, despite careful cleaning, always retained microscopic traces of lubricating oil. The friction of the valve mechanism itself could generate sparks. The result was predictable: oil-oxygen contact, ignition, explosion. Yanagimoto's insight came not from chemistry, but from careful observation of how the explosions occurred. Every failed torpedo had exploded within the first 5 seconds of operation. None had exploded after achieving steady-state running. This suggested that the explosion hazard was specific to the starting sequence, when oxygen pressure was changing rapidly and mechanical friction was highest. If they could somehow get the engine running without introducing pure oxygen during this critical period, they might eliminate the explosion risk entirely. The solution, when they found it, had an elegant simplicity. Instead of starting the torpedo engine with pure oxygen, they would start it with ordinary compressed air. The air would get the engine turning, establish combustion, and stabilize the internal pressures. Only after the engine was running smoothly would they gradually introduce pure oxygen, mixing it with the airflow in slowly, increasing proportions until the engine was running on oxygen alone. The transition had to be gradual too. Rapid a change would still risk explosion, but if managed correctly, it might allow them to bypass the dangerous starting sequence entirely. Testing this hybrid starting system required modifications to the torpedo's internal plumbing. They needed 2 separate pressure vessels, one containing compressed air for starting, one containing pure oxygen for sustained running. They needed valves that could regulate the gradual transition from air to oxygen, and they needed a control mechanism that could manage this transition automatically, without human intervention, since once a torpedo was launched, no one could adjust its internal systems. By December of 1930, Yanagimoto's team had fabricated a prototype incorporating these modifications. The weapon was tested on the morning of December 19th at the Kure facility. Asakuma watched from the same bunker where he had witnessed the previous failures. The torpedo launched smoothly. 1 second passed, 2 seconds, 5 seconds, 10. The weapon accelerated away across the bay, running straight and true, leaving only the faintest trace of bubbles. 30 seconds, 1 minute, 2 minutes. The torpedo continued running until it reached the safety nets at the far end of the test range, more than 1,200 meters distant. It had worked perfectly. Over the next 18 months, they refined the design through dozens of test firings. The gradual oxygen introduction system proved remarkably reliable once properly calibrated. The explosion problem, which had seemed insurmountable, had been solved through patient engineering rather than revolutionary chemistry. By mid-1932, they were ready to demonstrate the weapon to senior Navy leadership. The demonstration firing took place on July 26, 1932. The target was the battleship Ucky, a 20-year-old vessel scheduled for disposal under the terms of the London Naval Treaty. 3 experimental oxygen torpedoes were fired from a surface launcher at a range of 8,000 meters. All 3 hit. The Ucky broke in half and sank in less than 4 minutes. A second target ship, the Satsuma, was dispatched with equal efficiency. The demonstration had accomplished 2 things. It proved that the oxygen torpedo worked reliably, and it proved that its destructive power exceeded anything in the Imperial Japanese Navy's existing arsenal. Rear Admiral Kishimoto, watching from the observation vessel, reportedly said very little during the demonstration. When the Satsuma disappeared beneath the waves, he turned to Asakuma and spoke one sentence: "Begin production planning immediately." The informal suspension of the oxygen torpedo project was over. Now it would become official policy. The weapon that emerged from this development process was designated the Type 93, indicating its adoption in the Japanese calendar, the year 2593, which corresponded to 1933 in the Western calendar. Its specifications were extraordinary by any standard. Length, 9.6 meters. Diameter, 610 millimeters. Weight, 2,700 kilograms. Warhead, 490 kilograms of Type 97 explosive, roughly equivalent in destructive power to a 16-inch battleship shell. Speed and range, 48 knots for 22,000 meters, or 36 knots for 40,000 meters. These numbers require context to appreciate fully the standard American Mark 15 destroyer torpedo, the weapon that would arm U.S. surface combatants throughout the Pacific War, could travel at 45 knots for 6,000 yards, or 33 knots for 15,000 yards. The Type 93 could reach targets nearly 3 times as distant. This range advantage was not merely impressive on paper, it was operationally transformative. It meant that Japanese destroyers and cruisers could launch torpedoes while still over the horizon from their targets, before American radar could detect their approach. It meant they could fire at ranges from which American ships would not expect torpedo attacks, leading to catastrophic misinterpretations of tactical situations. But range and speed were only part of the Type 93's advantage. The near-wakeless running provided by pure oxygen combustion made the weapon extremely difficult to spot, even in daylight. American lookouts trained to watch for the characteristic white wake of a conventional torpedo found themselves unable to detect Type 93 seconds until seconds before impact, when it was far too late for evasive maneuvers. And the massive warhead, heavier than anything carried by Western torpedoes, could break the keel of a cruiser with a single hit. The Imperial Japanese Navy understood that it possessed a weapon without equivalent in any foreign navy. Security around the Type 93 program became absolute. The torpedoes were never referred to as oxygen torpedoes in any official documentation. The oxygen flask was labeled secondary air tank to maintain the fiction that the weapon used conventional propulsion. Torpedomen who serviced the weapons were told they were handling a specialized high-pressure air system. Only a small number of officers and senior enlisted personnel knew the true nature of the propulsion system. When Type 93 seconds were stored aboard ships, they were kept in specially ventilated magazines separate from conventional ordnance. but the reason given was sensitivity to temperature changes, not explosion risk. This operational security proved remarkably effective. When war began in the Pacific in December of 1941, neither American nor British intelligence had any clear picture of Japanese torpedo capabilities. U.S. Navy doctrine assumed that Japanese torpedoes were roughly comparable to American weapons, perhaps marginally better in some respects, perhaps marginally worse in others, but fundamentally similar in range and performance. This assumption would prove catastrophically wrong. The first major surface action between American and Japanese forces came on February 27, 1942, in the Java Sea. A combined American, British, Dutch, Australian fleet under Dutch Rear Admiral Karel Doorman encountered a Japanese force covering an invasion convoy. The battle began in late afternoon, with both sides exchanging long-range gunfire. As darkness fell, Doorman's force closed to what he believed was effective torpedo range, approximately 10,000 yards. The Japanese destroyers, still beyond the range of Allied torpedoes, launched a spread of Type 93 seconds. The torpedoes ran for more than 6 miles before striking their targets. The Dutch light cruiser HNLMS Java took 2 torpedo hits and broke apart. The British heavy cruiser HMS Exeter was crippled by a single torpedo that detonated beneath her boiler rooms. In both cases, Allied officers initially assumed they had been struck by torpedoes fired by unseen Japanese submarines operating in coordination with the surface force. The alternative, that they had been hit by torpedoes fired from destroyers that were barely visible on the horizon, seemed impossible based on known torpedo technology. This pattern repeated itself throughout the naval battles of 1942 and early 1943. At the Battle of Savo Island in August 1942, a Japanese force sank 4 Allied cruisers in a nighttime engagement. Type 93 torpedoes accounted for much of the destruction. At the Battle of Tassafaronga in November 1942, 5 Japanese destroyers fought 8 American cruisers and destroyers to a standstill, sinking the cruiser USS Northampton and damaging 3 others with long-range torpedo strikes. American after-action reports repeatedly referenced unexpected torpedo hits from implausible ranges, often attributing them to submarine attacks. The truth did not emerge until mid-1943, when American forces recovered intact Type 93 torpedoes from damaged Japanese ships in the Solomon Islands. Analysis of these weapons revealed the oxygen propulsion system and forced a complete reassessment of Japanese naval capabilities. By that time, however, the strategic situation in the Pacific had already shifted. American industrial production was overwhelming Japanese capacity. American code-breaking was providing precise intelligence on Japanese movements. And American submarines, having finally solved their own torpedo problems, were systematically destroying Japan's merchant marine. The Type 93 remained a formidable weapon, but it could not compensate for these broader disadvantages. For the engineers who had developed the oxygen torpedo, the war years brought a mix of pride and horror, pride that their weapon had performed exactly as designed, achieving tactical successes that validated years of difficult development work. Horror at the costs that success entailed not just to the enemy, but to Japanese forces themselves. The Type 93's Shimose explosive warhead was far more shock-sensitive than TNT-based explosives. This made the warhead more destructive when it struck a target, but it also meant that Type 93 seconds aboard Japanese ships could detonate if struck by enemy fire. Several Japanese destroyers and cruisers were lost when American bombs or shells triggered sympathetic detonations of their own torpedo magazines. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The destroyer Suzuya was lost at the Battle off Samar in October 1944 when a near-miss bomb detonated her Type 93 storage. The cruiser had been carrying a full load of 24 torpedoes. The resulting chain reaction of explosions tore the ship apart in less than 2 minutes. Takeshi Yamamoto, the torpedo man who had launched a Type 93 at Tassafaronga in November 1942, was aboard Suzuya when she blew up. He was among the 400 sailors who died in the explosion. He was 23 years old. Commander Asakuma survived the war. He was serving at the Navy Technical Department in Tokyo when Japan surrendered in August 1945. In the immediate post-war years, American technical intelligence teams interviewed him extensively about the Type 93's development. These interviews were classified, but portions were eventually declassified in the 1960s. Asakuma spoke candidly about the engineering challenges his team had overcome and about the decision to continue development work even after the official suspension order. When asked whether he had considered the possibility that his weapon would be used to kill thousands of Allied sailors, he reportedly paused for a long time before answering. "We were engineers," he said finally. "Our job was to solve the technical problem. The tactical and strategic implications were not our responsibility." This answer, carefully phrased in the formal Japanese manner appropriate for an interview with occupation authorities, nevertheless reveals something essential about the development of weapons during the Second World War. The engineers at Covert who perfected the oxygen torpedo were not ideologically driven fanatics. They were skilled professionals solving an interesting technical problem. The fact that the solution to this problem would enable the killing of enemy sailors at unprecedented ranges was, from their perspective, incidental to the engineering achievement itself. They had been asked to build a better torpedo. They had succeeded. That their success contributed to one of the most effective naval weapons of the war was, in their view, simply evidence that they had done their jobs well. But there is another way to understand their story. The Type 93 torpedo's development was not just a tale of engineering ingenuity. It was also a case study in the consequences of circumventing official restrictions for what seem, at the time, like good reasons. When Kishimoto ordered the oxygen torpedo project suspended in 1929, he did so because the weapon had proven too dangerous to deploy safely. He was, by all available evidence, correct. The explosions during testing were not flukes. They were inherent to the nature of high-pressure oxygen systems operating in environments contaminated with combustible materials. Asakuma and Yanagimoto's solution to this problem, the hybrid air-oxygen starting system, was clever, but it did not eliminate the underlying danger. It merely managed it to an acceptable level. Acceptable is, of course, a relative term. To the Imperial Japanese Navy's leadership in the 1930s, developing a weapon that gave destroyers the striking power of battleships was worth considerable risk. To the families of the 400 sailors who died when Suzuya exploded, that calculation might appear less favorable. To Yamamoto, in the seconds before the explosion that killed him, the distinction between a weapon that was dangerous to the enemy and a weapon that was dangerous to its operators had collapsed entirely. The paradox of the Type 93's success is that it achieved everything its designers intended while simultaneously validating the concerns of those who had opposed its development. It was the most effective torpedo of World War II, sinking or heavily damaging dozens of Allied warships. It was also one of the most dangerous weapons ever deployed by any navy, claiming the lives of hundreds of Japanese sailors in accidents and sympathetic detonations that conventional torpedoes would not have caused. Both things are true. The weapon worked exactly as designed. The weapon was fundamentally unsafe for operational use. These statements are not contradictory. They are complementary aspects of the same reality. After the war, no navy adopted oxygen torpedo technology. The United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, and later China all examined captured Type 93 seconds and all reached the same conclusion. The performance advantages did not justify the operational risks. Modern torpedoes use different propulsion systems, electric motors, hydrogen peroxide, solid fuel that provide adequate performance without requiring crews to handle large quantities of pure oxygen aboard warships. The Type 93 remains unique, a weapon that could only have emerged from the specific combination of tactical necessity, institutional flexibility, and acceptance of risk that characterized the Imperial Japanese Navy in the 1930s. Toshihide Asakuma died in Tokyo in 1967 at the age of 74. His obituary in the Asahi Shimbun mentioned his naval service, but did not specifically reference the Type 93 torpedo. By that time, Japan's post-war constitution prohibited the nation from maintaining offensive military capabilities, and there was little appetite for celebrating weapons development from the war years. The torpedo that Asakuma and his colleagues had spent years perfecting, the weapon that had sunk more Allied warships than perhaps any other Japanese naval innovation, was relegated to the status of historical footnote. But for the men who fought in the Pacific War, the Type 93 was never a footnote. American sailors who survived torpedo hits at Savo Island, Tassafaronga, Vela Gulf, and a dozen other night battles carried vivid memories of weapons appearing from impossible ranges, running without visible wakes, striking with devastating force. For them, the long lance represented something more disturbing than just an effective weapon. It represented the moment when they learned that their assumptions about technological parity were wrong, that the enemy possessed capabilities they had not anticipated, that the war would be harder and bloodier than they had imagined. The morning of November 30th, 1942. Takeshi Yamamoto, standing at his firing station aboard a Japanese destroyer, did not know he was about to launch one of the most advanced weapons of the naval war. He knew only that his orders were clear, his training was thorough, and his weapon had been maintained to exacting standards. What happened after he pressed the firing button, how far the torpedo would run, what it would hit, who would die as a consequence, was beyond his control. He was a cog in a system vastly larger than himself, a system that had taken an engineering challenge and transformed it into a tool for killing at ranges previously thought impossible. The torpedo launched smoothly, exactly as designed. It ran for 4 miles through the black water, its oxygen-fueled engine burning cleanly, leaving almost no wake. It struck the USS Northampton amidships, below the waterline. The explosion tore open 3 watertight compartments. The cruiser took on more air than 3,000 tons of water in the first 15 minutes. At 0300 hours, the order came to abandon ship. At 0335, Northampton rolled to port and sank. Yamamoto would not learn these details until weeks later, when his ship returned to Rabaul and the after-action reports were circulated. By then, he had loaded and launched 3 more Type 93 seconds, participated in 2 more night actions, and watched one of those torpedoes prematurely detonate 200 meters after launch, showering his ship's deck with fragments. The weapon that had been designed to give Japan an unbeatable advantage in surface combat had worked perfectly in some circumstances and catastrophically failed in others, exactly as the engineers who developed it should have predicted. But that is the nature of weapons development in wartime. The engineering challenges are clear and quantifiable. The human costs are distant and abstract. By the time the abstraction resolves into reality, when the weapon is firing, when men are dying, when the unintended consequences become undeniable, it is far too late to reconsider the decisions that led to this moment. The only option is to continue forward, to use the weapon that has been built, to hope that its advantages outweigh its costs, and to live with whatever follows. Part 2. The education of a Type 93 torpedo man began not with the weapon itself, but with silence. In the spring of 1938, Petty Officer 2nd Class Kenji Matsuda reported to the Naval Torpedo School at Yokosuka for advanced training. He had already completed basic torpedo training, had served 2 years aboard a destroyer, and considered himself competent with the standard 21-inch Type 90 torpedo. The Type 93 course, he assumed, would be a straightforward upgrade, learning to handle a larger, more powerful version of weapons he already understood. The first lecture disabused him of this assumption immediately. The instructor, a grizzled chief petty officer named Harada stood before the class of 30 torpedomen and spoke for 10 minutes about what they were forbidden to discuss. They could not mention the weapon's propulsion system. They could not discuss its range or speed with anyone outside the torpedo division, including other crew members aboard their own ships. They could not write about it in personal letters. If captured, they were to claim ignorance of technical details beyond basic handling procedures. Violation of these security protocols, Harada explained with bureaucratic precision, would result in immediate reassignment to the worst billets in the Imperial Japanese Navy, possibly after time in a military prison. Only after this preamble did the actual instruction begin. The Type 93, Matsuda learned, was not merely a larger torpedo. It was a fundamentally different machine, requiring different handling, different maintenance, different safety protocols. The oxygen system demanded absolute cleanliness. Any oil contamination, a fingerprint on the wrong surface, a residue of lubricant in the wrong fitting could cause a catastrophic explosion. Before loading a Type 93, torpedomen had to wash their hands with a special solvent, then with soap, then rinse 3 times with distilled water. They wore lint-free cotton gloves during handling. Tools had to be cleaned with potassium permanganate solution to remove all traces of petroleum products. The actual loading procedure took 45 minutes per torpedo, 3 times longer than loading a conventional weapon. First, the Type 93 was visually inspected for any damage to its hull plating or propeller. The inspection followed a checklist of 87 items. Any discrepancy, no matter how minor, meant the weapon could not be loaded. Next, the oxygen flask pressure was verified using a special gauge kept in a locked cabinet. The reading had to fall within a narrow range, 235 to 245 kilograms per square centimeter. Too low meant insufficient range, too high meant explosion risk. The compressed air flask for starting was similarly checked, though its acceptable pressure range was wider. Only after these preliminary checks were complete could the torpedo be moved to the launcher. The Type 93 weighed 2,700 kilograms, more than twice the weight of most human beings. Moving it required a special handling cart and a team of 6 men working in careful coordination. The weapon had to be kept perfectly horizontal during movement. Any tilt beyond 5 degrees could disturb the gyroscope mechanism, or worse, or shift liquid within the oxygen flask in ways that might cause pressure irregularities. Matsuda learned to move in smooth, deliberate motions, never jerking or rushing, treating the torpedo like an unexploded bomb, which in some respects it was. The training included extensive instruction on what could go wrong. The instructors at Yokosuka did not sugarcoat the dangers. Oxygen explosions were described in clinical detail. The pressure wave, the fireball, the secondary detonations as the warhead was sympathetically triggered. Torpedomen were shown photographs of damage from test accidents, twisted metal, scorched bulkheads, the aftermath of energies suddenly and violently released in enclosed spaces. They were told about the destroyers Kikuzuki and Akizuki, both of which had experienced oxygen system failures in 1937. Kikuzuki's explosion had killed 3 men and injured 7 more. Akizuki's had been worse, detonating the warhead and effectively destroying the ship's entire stern section. 42 men died in that incident. These cautionary tales had their intended effect. By the time Matsuda completed the 6-week Type 93 course, he possessed a healthy respect bordering on fear for the weapons he would spend the next 4 years loading, maintaining, and firing. This was precisely the attitude the Navy wanted its torpedomen to have. Complacency around oxygen systems was lethal. Proper fear kept people alive. Matsuda was assigned to the destroyer Hagikaze in July of 1938. The ship carried 8 Type 93 seconds in 2 quadruple mountings, 1 forward and 1 aft. The torpedo division consisted of 16 men, 2 petty officers who had attended the advanced school at Yokosuka, and 14 seamen who performed the routine maintenance and handling under supervision. The work was never-ending, Every 48 hours, each torpedo had to be removed from its launcher, inspected, and tested. The oxygen system required particular attention. The flask seals had to be checked for any sign of leakage. The pressure had to be verified and recorded in the maintenance log. Any reading outside the acceptable range triggered a complete system purge and refill, a procedure that took 4 hours and required the ship to be pierced up at a dock facility with access to the specialized oxygen-generating equipment. This maintenance burden was not trivial. In the late 1930s, the combined fleet's destroyer force included more than 80 vessels equipped with Type 93 seconds. Each ship carried 8 to 16 torpedoes. Assuming a conservative average of 10 torpedoes per ship, that meant 800 Type 93 seconds in active service, each requiring inspection every 2 days. The oxygen generating and filling facilities at Yokosuka, Kure, Sasebo, and Maizuru operated continuously, processing thousands of cubic meters of oxygen monthly. The logistics of maintaining this weapon system across a fleet dispersed throughout the Western Pacific represented an enormous organizational challenge, one that the Imperial Japanese Navy handled with characteristic efficiency until the infrastructure itself began to crumble under the pressures of war. But in 1938 and 1939, before the war expanded beyond China, the system functioned smoothly. Matsuda fell into the rhythm of shipboard life. Maintenance, drills, more maintenance, occasional firing exercises. The actual firing of a Type 93 was, paradoxically, the least complicated part of working with the weapon. Once loaded and prepared, the launch was electrically triggered from the bridge. The torpedo slid from its tube, the starting air initiated combustion, and the weapon accelerated away. The entire process took perhaps 3 seconds. Everything before that moment, the hours of preparation, the meticulous safety checks, the careful handling was invisible to anyone not part of the torpedo division. War came to Hagikaze on December 8, 1941, when she sortied from Cam Ranh Bay as part of the covering force for the invasion of Malaya. The destroyer's first action came 3 days later, when a British force attempted to intercept the invasion fleet. The battle that followed, later known as the Battle of Kuantan, was brief and one-sided. Hagikaze fired 4 Type 93 seconds at a range of 18,000 meters. 2 hit the battleship HMS Prince of Wales, contributing to the damage that would send her to the bottom later that afternoon. From Matsuda's perspective, the action consisted of standing at his station, feeling the ship vibrate as the launchers fired, hearing the reports over the interior communication system. He never saw the torpedoes strike. He never saw Prince of Wales sink. The war, at that moment, was merely a sequence of procedures executed under pressure, no different in principle from the hundreds of practice drills he had performed. This would prove characteristic of Matsuda's war experience. Over the next 2 years, Hagikaze participated in dozens of engagements. She fired Type 93 seconds at Savo Island, at Cape Esperance, at Tassafaronga, at Kula Gulf. Matsuda loaded, maintained, and prepared torpedoes that sank cruisers, destroyers, transports, and smaller vessels. The tally, if he had kept one, would have been impressive. But from his position below decks, the war remained abstract. He knew the targets only as coordinates and bearing marks. He knew the results only from official reports read days later. The connection between his work and its consequences was intellectual rather than visceral. He was, in the language of modern warfare, insulated from the human reality of what he was helping to accomplish. This insulation began to crack in August of 1943. Hagikaze was operating in the Central Solomons, running supplies to Kolombangara Island under cover of darkness. American air superiority made daylight operations suicidal. The ship arrived at the anchorage before dawn, unloaded supplies, and prepared to depart before first light. But the timing was too tight. At 05:45 hours, with Hagikaze still within sight of the island, American dive bombers from Henderson Field found her. The attack lasted 7 minutes. Hagikazi's anti-aircraft guns shot down one bomber, but the rest pressed their attacks with professional skill. A 1,000-pound bomb struck the water 10 meters off the starboard side, directly adjacent to the aft torpedo mount. The explosion's shockwave penetrated the hull, rupturing the oxygen flasks in 2 Type 93 seconds. The result was exactly what the instructors at Yokosuka had warned about. Matsuda was in the forward torpedo handling room when the aft mount exploded. The detonation was loud enough to be clearly audible even through multiple watertight bulkheads and over the roar of the anti-aircraft guns. The ship lurched violently. Emergency lighting activated as the main power failed. Then came the secondary explosions as the remaining torpedoes in the aft mount cooked off, their warheads adding to the destruction. The entire stern section of the destroyer, everything aft of the aft funnel, simply ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. What remained was a tangle of twisted metal barely recognizable as part of a ship. Hagikazi did not sink immediately. The forward bulkhead of the engine room held, preventing progressive flooding, but the ship was clearly finished as a fighting unit. She could not steam, could not navigate, could barely maintain position in the water. The captain gave the order to abandon ship. Matsuda went over the side with the rest of the crew, swimming away from the dying destroyer toward boats from a nearby destroyer that had come to assist. Behind him, Hagikazi settled lower in the water, her bow rising as the flooded stern dragged her down. She sank at 06, 25 hours, 40 minutes after the first bomb hit. Of Hagikazi's crew of 240 men, 68 died. Most of the casualties occurred in the initial explosion of the torpedo mount. The men in the aft torpedo handling room 4 of Matsuda's close friends among them were killed instantly. Others died from injuries sustained in the blast or drowned during the evacuation. Matsuda survived without serious injury, but the experience fundamentally altered his understanding of the weapon he had spent 4 years servicing. The Type 93 was dangerous to the enemy. This he had known intellectually. Now he understood, in a way that no amount of training could convey, that it was equally dangerous to him. The Imperial Japanese Navy's official assessment of the Hagikazi incident acknowledged that the ship had been lost due to sympathetic detonation of her torpedo magazine, triggered by a near-miss bomb. The report did not recommend any changes to Type 93 handling or storage procedures. The risk was deemed acceptable given the weapon's combat effectiveness. This calculation would be repeated throughout the war as more destroyers and cruisers suffered similar catastrophic losses. The heavy cruiser Chokai lost at Sama, the destroyer Suzuya at the same battle, the cruiser Mogami at the Surigao Strait all went down, at least partially due to Type 93 explosions triggered by battle damage. The cumulative toll of Japanese sailors killed by their own torpedo systems likely exceeded 1,000 men. For the engineers who had developed the Type 93, these losses represented a tragic validation of concerns raised more than a decade earlier. Rear Admiral Kishimoto, who had suspended the oxygen torpedo project in 1929, citing safety concerns, died in 1944, having been proven essentially correct. The weapon was operationally effective but inherently dangerous. The fact that it sank many Allied ships did not change the fact that it also killed many Japanese sailors. Both things were true, both things mattered. Commander Asakuma, the man who had ignored Kishimoto's suspension order and continued development work anyway, grappled with this reality in his own way. In a letter to his wife written in September of 1944, he acknowledged feeling troubled by reports of ships lost to torpedo explosions. "We built the weapon to strike the enemy," he wrote, "but perhaps we did not sufficiently consider all the implications." The letter, preserved in the post-war papers donated to the National Archives, represents one of the few instances where Asakuma expressed anything resembling doubt about his work on the Type 93 project. But such doubts, if they existed, came too late to affect the trajectory of the war. By mid-1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy was in irreversible decline. American industrial production had overwhelmed Japanese capacity. The combined fleet had suffered crippling losses in the carrier battles of 1942 and 1943, then further losses in the surface engagements of late 1943. Japanese destroyers still carried Type 93 seconds, still occasionally achieved tactical successes with them, but these successes no longer translated into strategic advantage. The war had moved beyond the point where superior torpedo technology could compensate for American advantages in numbers, industrial capacity, radar, and code breaking. The final major employment of Type 93 torpedoes came at the Battle off Samar on October 25, 1944. Japanese heavy cruisers and destroyers attacked a force of American escort carriers, launching dozens of Type 93 seconds at close range. Several carriers were hit, several were damaged, but the attack ultimately failed to destroy the American force. More significantly, the Japanese lost 3 heavy cruisers during the battle, at least 2 of them partially due to sympathetic detonations of their own torpedoes when struck by American fire. The Type 93 had come full circle. A weapon designed to give Japan an overwhelming advantage in surface combat had, by late 1944, become as much a liability as an asset. Kenji Matsuda survived the sinking of Hajikaze and was reassigned to another destroyer, Urakaze, in October of 1943. He served aboard her for 11 months, continuing to perform the same torpedo maintenance duties he had done since 1938. On September 21, 1944, Urakaze was torpedoed by the American submarine USS Ceylon while escorting a convoy in the South China Sea. The destroyer broke in half and sank in less than 3 minutes. Matsuda was below decks when the torpedo struck. He went down with the ship. He was 26 years old. The irony of Matsuda's death was not lost on his family when they received the notification letter. He had spent 6 years working with torpedoes, had survived 1 ship sunk by bombs, triggering torpedo explosions, and had ultimately died from a torpedo fired by the enemy he had spent those years training to fight. The weapon he had serviced so carefully, maintained so meticulously, had in the end killed him, just not in the way anyone might have predicted. After the war, when American technical teams examined captured Type 93 torpedoes and interviewed the engineers who developed them, the question inevitably arose, was the weapon worth the costs? The question did not lend itself to easy answers. In purely military terms, the Type 93 had been extraordinarily effective. It sank more Allied warships than any other Japanese torpedo, probably more than all other Japanese torpedoes combined. It gave Japanese destroyers and cruisers a capability that allowed them to fight American forces on more equal terms than would otherwise have been possible. These are measurable achievements, but the costs were also measurable. More than 1,000 Japanese sailors died in accidental explosions or sympathetic detonations of Type 93 systems. The maintenance burden absorbed thousands of man-hours that might have been applied to other priorities. The security requirements around the weapon, complicated logistics and training, and ultimately, the Type 93's tactical advantages did not translate into strategic victory. Japan lost the Pacific War comprehensively. The oxygen torpedo, for all its sophistication, could not compensate for fundamental disadvantages in industrial capacity, resources, and ultimately national strategy. The post-war fate of oxygen torpedo technology was instructive. The United States Navy examined captured Type 93 seconds with great interest. They recognized the weapon's capabilities, understood its advantages, and seriously considered developing their own oxygen torpedoes. Multiple feasibility studies were conducted between 1946 and 1952. All reached the same conclusion. The operational risks outweighed the performance benefits. The handling requirements were too burdensome. The explosion hazards were too severe. Alternative propulsion technologies, electric motors, hydrogen peroxide systems could deliver adequate performance without requiring sailors to work with large quantities of pure oxygen in a combat environment. The British Navy reached identical conclusions. So did the Soviet Navy, despite having examined German oxygen torpedo experiments captured in 1945. The unanimous verdict of the post-war naval engineering community was that the Type 93 represented an evolutionary dead end. It was an effective weapon built on an inherently dangerous foundation. Modern technology could achieve similar results through safer means. This verdict represented, in a sense, the ultimate validation of Rear Admiral Kishimoto's original decision in 1929 to suspend the oxygen torpedo project. He had been overruled, circumvented, and eventually forced to accept the Type 93's development and deployment. History proved him essentially correct. The weapon worked, but should not have been built. Both things can be true simultaneously. Toshihide Asakuma's post-war life was quiet and largely unremarkable. He worked briefly as a consultant to Japanese industrial firms trying to rebuild in the ruins of the war economy. He taught engineering courses at Tokyo University for several years in the 1950s. He gave occasional interviews to military historians researching Japan's wartime weapons programs. In these interviews, he was unfailingly polite, precise, and somewhat evasive about certain aspects of the Type 93's development, particularly the period when he continued work on the project after the official suspension order. In a 1963 interview with the U.S. Naval Institute, Asakuma was asked directly whether he felt any responsibility for the Japanese sailors killed by accidental explosions of the weapons he had helped develop. His answer, translated from Japanese, was carefully calibrated. Every weapon system involves trade-offs between capability and safety. We attempted to manage the Type 93's risks through proper training and procedures. That these procedures were not always perfectly followed under combat conditions is unfortunate, but perhaps inevitable. War is dangerous. This answer, diplomatic and technically accurate, nevertheless, sidesteps the core question. The decision to develop and deploy the Type 93 was not primarily about trade-offs and procedures. It was about accepting a level of risk that every other major navy of the era, examining the same technology, decided was unacceptable. The Imperial Japanese Navy made a different calculation. Whether that calculation was correct depends entirely on how one weighs tactical effectiveness against human costs, a question that does not admit of any purely technical answer. The last known Type 93 torpedo was destroyed by the U.S. Navy in 1952 at a weapons testing facility in California. The weapon was fired from a captured Japanese destroyer that had been preserved for evaluation purposes. The torpedo ran perfectly for its full range of 22,000 meters, struck the target ship dead center, and detonated as designed. American engineers noted in their final report that the Type 93 remained, even 7 years after the war's end, superior in most respects to any torpedo in the U.S. inventory. They reiterated their recommendation against developing American oxygen torpedoes. The performance advantages, they concluded, did not justify the operational burdens and safety risks. That report marked the end of operational oxygen torpedo development by any navy. The technology that Asakuma and his colleagues had spent more than a decade perfecting, that had killed thousands of Allied sailors and hundreds of Japanese sailors, that had shaped the naval war in the Pacific in ways both obvious and subtle, passed into history. Modern torpedoes use different technologies, achieve adequate performance through different means, and do not require anyone to handle high-pressure oxygen aboard warships in combat zones. The engineers who examine these modern systems sometimes acknowledge that they are, in narrow technical terms, less elegant than the Type 93. They are also safer, more reliable, and more practical for the crews who must maintain them. These attributes, in the end, matter more than elegance. Kenji Matsuda's name appears on the memorial at Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, along with more than 2 million other Japanese war dead. There is no indication on the memorial of how he died, what ship he served aboard, or what specific duties he performed during his naval service. He is simply one name among millions, a sailor who did his duty as he understood it and died in the service of his country. His story, like the stories of most ordinary servicemen in any war, has been largely forgotten, except by his immediate family. But Matsuda's story is, in some sense, more representative of the Type 93's reality than the dramatic accounts of night battles and surprise torpedo strikes. The weapon was not primarily about dramatic moments, it was about maintenance schedules, safety procedures, training protocols, and routine work performed day after day by people like Matsuda. The torpedoes that struck Allied warships were maintained by men who cleaned them, checked them, loaded them, and prepared them with professional care. These men understood the dangers. They followed the procedures as best they could. Some of them were killed by the weapons they served. Most simply did their jobs and hoped to survive. In the end, the story of the Type 93 oxygen torpedo is not really about technology at all. It is about the decisions people make when facing difficult engineering problems, about the risks they choose to accept and the consequences they choose to ignore, about the distance between abstract technical achievement and concrete human costs. The engineers at Kure who solved the oxygen explosion problem accomplished something genuinely impressive. Their solution worked. Ships equipped with their weapon achieved tactical successes that would not have been possible with conventional torpedoes. These are facts. It is also a fact that their solution was inherently dangerous, that it killed hundreds of Japanese sailors, that every other major navy examined the same technology and decided the risks were unacceptable. These facts exist alongside the first set, neither cancelling them out nor being cancelled by them. The Type 93 was both a triumph of engineering and a cautionary tale about the hidden costs of pursuing performance advantages without sufficient regard for operational safety. History does not resolve this contradiction. It simply records it, leaving each generation to draw its own conclusions about acceptable risks, necessary trade-offs, and the distance between what engineers can build and what navies should deploy. The oxygen torpedo worked. People died because it worked, and people died despite it working. Both things are true. Both things matter. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.